I flew in from Britain without warning to visit my daughter and her family after 2 long years. Imagine my surprise when I found her chained up in the garage. "It is all my mother-in-law and my husband," she said, barely breathing. My revenge was ruthless. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and tried to destroy your family. 2 years of managing private security logistics and supply chains in London had dulled my expectations of quiet American suburbs. I expected manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and annoying homeowners associations when I pulled my rental car into the driveway of my daughter Tara's home in a wealthy suburban neighborhood. I did not expect the chilling absolute silence that greeted me. The front door was locked tight. The heavy plantation blinds were drawn completely shut against the midday sun, sealing the house like a vault. My instincts, honed from decades of overseas contracting in hostile territories, instantly flared. I dropped my suitcase on the porch and immediately walked the perimeter of the property. The exterior security cameras were dead. Someone had deliberately severed the thick cables right at the junction box using professional wire snips. I moved silently toward the detached garage at the edge of the property. It was windowless, baking in the suffocating afternoon heat. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound echoed from behind the heavy wooden side door. I noticed a heavy-duty industrial padlock securing the latch. This was a residential suburban garage, not a military munitions depot. There was absolutely no reason for a lock of that caliber, unless someone was trying to keep something inside from getting out. I did not knock. I did not call out my daughter's name. I walked swiftly back to my rental car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a solid steel tire iron. I wedged the flattened edge of the iron directly beneath the padlock latch, applied my entire body weight for leverage, and shattered the internal locking mechanism with a single brutal snap. The door swung open. The wave of suffocating heat and the unmistakable stench of human decay hit me like a physical blow. In the dim, stifling light, I found my daughter. Tara was horribly emaciated, curled on the filthy concrete floor, her ankle secured to a structural steel plumbing pipe by a heavy chain. A primitive, dirty water drip hung above her head. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, her cheekbones jutting sharply through her pale, bruised skin. She did not scream or cry out. Instead, her trembling hand rose from the concrete, and she tapped her thumb against her index finger twice, then held her palm flat against her chest. It was a silent distress and extraction signal I had taught her when she was 12 years old, right before a contracting deployment to a volatile region overseas. I knelt beside her, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs, but my professional training forced my mind into absolute icy clarity. She leaned her cracked, bleeding lips toward my ear and whispered 4 faint words that would dictate the rest of my life. Justin, Barbara, the trust. The pieces locked together in my mind instantly. Justin was her arrogant husband. Barbara was his mother. The trust was the $4 million account I had quietly set up for Tara years ago, engineered to activate only under specific emergency conditions. I reached for my phone, but my thumb stopped hovering over the emergency dial button. If I called the police right now, Justin would hear the sirens approaching. He would inevitably claim she had suffered a violent psychotic break, that he locked her up for her own safety, because she was a danger to herself. He would hire aggressive defense attorneys, twist the narrative, and legally tie up the trust fund. The physical and financial evidence of whatever he was truly doing would vanish behind red tape. I could not rely on the slow, predictable machinery of the law. I needed absolute, unquestionable control of the battlefield. I stroked Tara's matted hair, whispering that she was safe, that she needed to remain perfectly quiet and trust my process. I stepped outside the garage, keeping my body pressed tightly against the vinyl siding, completely out of sight from the main house windows. I dialed a highly encrypted number that was not saved in my contacts list. Vince answered on the second ring. He was my private fixer, a man who specialized in medical extractions and making problems disappear without generating official paperwork. I gave him the address and told him I needed a ghost team, absolute silence, and full trauma stabilization gear immediately. I paced the blind spot behind the garage. For 20 agonizing minutes, my eyes fixed unblinkingly on the back door of the house, my hand gripping the heavy steel tire iron. If Justin walked out that door, I knew with terrifying certainty that I would kill him on the spot, ruining any chance of securing Tara's assets and exposing the full depth of his conspiracy. A plain white utility van finally rolled to a silent stop at the edge of the alleyway behind the property. Vince and 2 heavily armed medics moved across the lawn with total precision. They entered the garage, deployed hydraulic bolt cutters, and severed the thick chain holding my daughter. They loaded her onto a collapsible tactical stretcher, hooked an intravenous drip into her arm, and vanished back into the van without a single word spoken aloud. As the van disappeared down the alley, the real work began. The cage was now empty, but the concrete floor was stained with blood sweat and the severed links of the chain. If Justin checked the garage and found her missing, he would immediately flee the state or destroy the financial evidence hidden inside the house. I grabbed a bottle of industrial bleach from a nearby storage shelf and scrubbed the concrete until my knuckles bled, erasing every trace of the extraction. I gathered the broken padlock, the cut chains, and the filthy water rig, shoving them deep into a heavy black trash bag. I loaded the bag into the trunk of my rental car, drove 3 miles to a local hardware store, and purchased the exact same brand and model of industrial padlock. I sped back to the house, holding my breath and scanning the windows as I pulled back into the driveway. The front door was still shut. The blinds were still drawn. I walked quickly to the side door of the garage, slid the new pristine padlock through the latch, and snapped it shut with a solid click. The perimeter was secured. The illusion was flawless. The cage was empty, but the trap was successfully set. I walked back to my rental car and retrieved my luggage from the trunk. I deliberately adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump slightly to mimic exhaustion. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a warm, clueless, and vulnerable smile. I walked up the paved path, stood on the front porch, and rang the doorbell. I waited. 30 seconds passed in heavy silence. I rang it again, leaning heavily on my suitcase, projecting the image of a weary, aging traveler arriving for a happy surprise visit. The deadbolt clicked loudly. The door opened a few inches. Justin stood in the doorway. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His eyes darted frantically to my suitcase, then back to my face, wide with unfiltered, absolute panic. He gripped the doorframe tightly, physically blocking the threshold to prevent me from looking inside. I smiled broadly, completely ignoring his terror. "Justin, my boy," I announced cheerfully, grabbing his rigid shoulder and giving it an affectionate, forceful squeeze. I got my dates mixed up and managed to catch an early flight out of London. I wanted to surprise my 2 favorite people in the world. "Where is my little girl?" Justin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as sweat formed on his forehead. He stammered, his eyes shifting nervously toward the staircase behind him. "Bruce, what a surprise. You really should have called first. Tara is not here right now." I kept the warm, oblivious smile plastered securely on my face. "Not here. Did she run to the grocery store? I can wait in the living room." I pushed my suitcase forward, forcing Justin to either step back or be physically run over. He retreated into the foyer, his breathing shallow and rapid. "No," he said, his voice trembling slightly, before he smoothed it out into a mask of rehearsed theatrical grief. "Bruce, things have been really difficult lately. Tara suffered a severe mental breakdown last month. It was terrifying for everyone. She voluntarily checked herself into a zero-contact silent wellness retreat up in the isolated mountains to recover. They do not allow any visitors or phone calls whatsoever. She just needed to be completely disconnected from the world to heal." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was looking me right in the eye, playing the devastated, supportive husband, while he fully believed my daughter was starving to death in chains, not 50 yards from where we stood. My internal rage burned hot enough to incinerate the entire house, but my outward expression remained completely gentle and concerned. "Oh, Justin," I said, reaching out to pat his arm again. "I had absolutely no idea. That sounds incredibly stressful for you to manage. You must be exhausted carrying this massive burden all alone." He nodded eagerly, desperately accepting the false sympathy I was feeding him. "It has been a total nightmare, Bruce. I just want her to get better and come home." I smiled, gripping the handle of my suitcase tightly, preparing to drop the anchor. "Well, then it is a very good thing I am here to help. I will just get settled into the guest room and wait right here for her to finish her retreat. I am not leaving this house until I see my daughter, Justin. We can keep each other company and manage the house together." Justin stood completely paralyzed by my relentless, suffocating hospitality. He could not refuse a worried, grieving father a place to stay without raising immediate suspicion and blowing his cover. He forced a sickly, defeated smile and gestured weakly toward the stairs. I walked past him, dragging my suitcase deep into the house, fully aware that the predator was now comfortably inside the gates and the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. Todd led the way through the vaulted foyer. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of synthetic lavender and chemical cleaners. Alan dragged his battered suitcase across the hardwood floors. He kept his spine slightly bent. He forced his breathing to sound shallow and labored. He was no longer the contractor who had survived extraction zones. He was a tired old man living on a pension. Todd pointed nervously toward the downstairs guest room. He told Alan to drop his bags and rest. Alan ignored the gesture. He continued walking down the main hall toward the master suite. The double doors were wide open. He stepped into the threshold and stopped. Diane stood in front of a massive gilded mirror. She was a woman who wore her entitlement like a weapon. She turned to face the doorway. She was wearing a silk robe that belonged to Megan. But that was not what made Alan's blood run cold. Resting casually against Diane's collarbone was a distinct teardrop diamond pendant. Alan had purchased that exact necklace in Antwerp. He had given it to Megan on her 30th birthday. Diane wore it as if it were cheap costume jewelry. The absolute arrogance of the usurper was staggering. Alan suppressed the violent instinct to cross the room and snap her neck. He let his jaw go slack. He blinked rapidly, projecting the image of a confused, overwhelmed senior citizen. Todd rushed up behind Alan, stammering a panicked introduction. He told his mother that Alan had flown in from Britain, completely unannounced. Diane did not flinch. She did not attempt to hide the necklace. She simply looked Alan up and down with an expression of profound distaste. Her eyes tracked from his unbranded cotton shirt to his scuffed travel boots. She let out a long, theatrical sigh. She crossed her arms and spoke in a voice dripping with venomous pity. She told Alan that this was incredibly inconvenient. She said they were already dealing with the massive emotional and financial fallout of his daughter's mental collapse. She asked him directly how he had even afforded the plane ticket on a fixed retirement income. Alan absorbed the insult perfectly. He let his shoulders slump further. He lowered his eyes to the floor. He apologized in a weak, trembling voice. He said he had scraped together his savings because he was worried about his little girl. He lied effortlessly, telling Diane that he knew he was a burden. He said he just wanted to be near family. Diane smiled a thin, predatory smile. She soaked up his submission. She took a step closer, towering over his hunched frame. She told him that Megan had always been incredibly unstable. She claimed that living with his daughter had been a nightmare for her son. She said they were doing everything they could to hold the pieces together. She complained about the cost of maintaining the property without Megan's income. She spoke as if the house already belonged to her. Alan listened to every word. He recorded her tone, her confidence, her utter lack of empathy. He nodded vigorously. He thanked Diane for stepping up. He told her that Todd was a good man for putting up with his daughter's flaws. The flattery worked exactly as intended. Diane relaxed her posture. Her ego demanded absolute superiority, and Alan fed it to her by the spoonful. She turned back to the mirror, adjusting the stolen diamond necklace with complete casual indifference. The window of opportunity was open. Alan pressed a trembling hand against his chest. He let out a ragged cough. He looked at Todd with wide, pleading eyes. He asked if he could trouble them for a tall glass of ice water and a couple of aspirin. He said the long flight had triggered his heart palpitations. Todd looked at his mother for permission. Diane rolled her eyes in profound annoyance. She waved her hand dismissively. She told Todd to go to the kitchen and fetch the old man some water. She told Alan not to drop dead in her hallway because she did not have time to deal with paramedics. She then walked into her massive walk-in closet to find the medication. Alan was entirely alone in the hallway. The facade vanished. His spine snapped straight. His hands stopped shaking. He had exactly 30 seconds. He reached into the concealed seam of his leather belt. He extracted 2 microscopic military-grade audio transmitters. They were the size of shirt buttons coated in industrial adhesive. He moved with silent, fluid precision. He took 4 rapid steps into the adjacent dining room. He dropped to one knee and pressed the first transmitter deep into the hollow recess beneath the heavy mahogany table. He stood up without making a sound. He crossed the hallway and slipped into Todd's home office. He scanned the room instantly. He pressed the second transmitter underneath the lip of the solid oak desk, right next to the primary power strip, where the ambient electrical hum would mask any electronic interference. He stepped back into the hallway just as the closet door swung open. Diane emerged holding a small white pill. Alan was already leaning heavily against the wall, clutching his chest and taking ragged, shallow breaths. Todd rounded the corner with a glass of water. Alan swallowed the pill. He thanked them profusely with a pathetic, wavering voice. He told them he would just stay out of their way in the guest room. Diane turned her back on him before he even finished speaking. Todd escorted him to the small bedroom at the far end of the hall and shut the door firmly. Alan set his suitcase on the floor. He locked the bedroom door. He reached into his false-bottomed shaving kit and extracted a secure receiver terminal. He inserted a tiny flesh-colored earpiece deep into his right ear canal. He calibrated the frequency. The audio feed from the dining room and the office crackled to life with crystal-clear precision. He sat in the darkness of the guest room. He did not unpack. He did not sleep. He sat perfectly still and waited for the predators to speak. The house grew quiet as the evening progressed. At midnight, the audio feed from the dining room transmitter picked up the sound of heavy, frantic footsteps. Todd was pacing. A chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Diane's voice filtered through the earpiece, sharp and agitated. She told Todd to sit down and stop wearing a hole in her floor. Todd's voice trembled with unfiltered panic. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He told his mother that this was a disaster. He said the old man was a wild card. He said Bruce might wake up early and wander around the property. Todd's voice dropped to a frantic, terrified hiss. He said if he goes outside, if he checks the garage, we are dead. He will hear her. We are going to prison for the rest of our lives. Alan stopped breathing. He listened to the undeniable confirmation of their guilt. He waited for Diane's response. He needed to know the exact parameters of their timeline. Diane's voice cut through the receiver like shards of ice. She did not sound afraid. She sounded utterly ruthless. She told her son to stop acting like a pathetic coward. She said the old man was a broke, senile idiot who could barely stand up straight. She said he would not check the garage because the padlock was secured and the windows were blacked out. She told Todd to maintain his composure and stick to the narrative. Todd continued to hyperventilate. He said they needed to finish it tonight. He said they needed to get rid of Megan before the sun came up. He said he could not handle the pressure of the old man sleeping under the same roof while his wife was chained to a pipe 50 yards away. Diane slammed her hand on the dining table. The sound echoed violently through Alan's earpiece. She told Todd absolutely not. She outlined the parameters of their execution plan with chilling clinical detachment. She said if they moved the body now, they risked leaving physical evidence. She told Todd that the chemistry needed time to complete its work. "Let him check the garage if he wants to," Diane said coldly. "The thallium is already destroying her central nervous system. It will be fully metabolized and untraceable in her blood by the time her organs completely shut down from the starvation. If we kill her now, the autopsy will show the poison. If we wait, the coroner will rule it a tragic self-inflicted mental health crisis, resulting in dehydration and exposure. We just need 3 more days." The transmission crackled with static. Alan sat in the absolute darkness of the guest room. The timeline was permanently etched into his mind. They were using a highly toxic, difficult-to-trace heavy metal. They were relying on starvation to mask the primary cause of death. They believed they had 72 hours until Megan expired. They believed they were completely in control of the narrative. They believed the old man was asleep, oblivious to their monstrous conspiracy. Alan reached up and tapped the receiver, saving the digital audio file to an encrypted offshore server. He had his confession. He had his timeline. He knew exactly what weapon they were using. The smoldering tension of the day evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating void. He had exactly 72 hours to sever their financial lifelines, dismantle their arrogant illusions, and orchestrate their absolute destruction. The silent reckoning was no longer a concept. It was an active countdown. Alan did not feel the sting of betrayal. He felt only the icy clarity of a professional contractor analyzing a hostile target. Todd and Diane had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that a quiet man was a weak man. They had assumed that age had eroded his capacity for violence. They had mistaken his silence for submission. He removed the earpiece and placed it carefully on the nightstand. The darkness of the guest room offered no comfort, only the stark reality of the battlefield. The thallium revelation changed the operational parameters. Thallium was a coward's weapon, a slow-acting toxin that mimicked degenerative disease. It meant Diane had been planning this execution for months, quietly administering the poison to Megan before locking her in the garage for the final agonizing stage of starvation. It meant every meal Diane had served, every glass of water she had handed his daughter, was laced with lethal intent. Alan stood up and walked silently to the window. He looked out through the blinds at the detached garage standing in the moonlight. He knew Megan was safe in the private clinic. He knew Owen's medical team was already flushing her system with Prussian blue, the standard antidote for severe thallium poisoning. His daughter would survive. But Todd and Diane did not know that. They were operating under the delusion that their victim was still chained to the steel pipe, slowly dying in the sweltering heat. He would let them keep that delusion. He would let them wake up tomorrow believing they held all the cards. He would smile at the breakfast table. He would drink their coffee. He would play the pathetic, grieving father seeking comfort from his loving son-in-law. He would feed their hubris until it swelled to the bursting point. And then when they were absolutely certain they had won, he would bring the hammer down. The 72-hour clock had officially started. Alan closed the blinds. The usurper wore his daughter's diamonds today. In 3 days, she would wear steel cuffs. The burner phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand, precisely at 2 a.m. I did not flinch. I had been sitting in the dark of the guest room for hours, staring at the sliver of moonlight bleeding through the drawn blinds. I picked up the device before the second vibration could rattle the wood. Owen was on the secure line. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, maintaining the sterile, clinical tone of a man who had delivered casualty reports from active war zones for 2 decades. He told me he had the preliminary blood panels from the private clinic. He said the encryption on the line was stable, but he kept his words clipped and precise. He confirmed that my daughter was severely dehydrated and suffering from advanced caloric deficit, but he explicitly stated that starvation was not what was shutting down her central nervous system. I gripped the plastic casing of the phone, my knuckles turning white in the shadows. Owen paused. a rare hesitation that sent a shard of pure ice directly into my chest. He told me she was dying from acute heavy metal toxicity. Specifically, he identified it as liquid thallium. He said they had been dosing her systematically for months. The word echoed in my mind, unleashing a flood of tactical knowledge from my past overseas logistics deployments. Thallium is a coward's weapon. It is entirely tasteless, completely odorless, and perfectly colorless. It mimics the natural symptoms of severe neurological degradation and rapid psychological collapse. It induces hair loss, extreme muscle tremors, severe paranoia, and eventual total organ failure. Todd and Diane had not just locked my daughter in a sweltering garage to starve. They had been actively poisoning her food and water long before she ever reached that concrete cage. They had engineered a complete, undeniable medical illusion to justify stripping away her freedom, destroying her credibility, and preparing to steal her massive trust fund. I instructed Owen to keep Megan on a continuous aggressive loop of Prussian blue, which is the only known binding antidote for severe thallium poisoning. I severed the connection and set the phone down on the mattress. There was no room for tears. Crying was a luxury for men who had time to mourn, and I had a rigorous schedule to keep. I checked the luminous dial of my watch. It was exactly 3 a.m. The suburban house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical humming of the central air conditioning unit. I stripped off my boots and stepped into the hallway in bare feet, keeping my weight perfectly balanced on the outside edges of my soles to prevent the hardwood floorboards from creaking. Decades of infiltrating hostile logistics compounds in foreign deserts translated seamlessly to navigating a wealthy sleeping American suburb. I moved silently past Todd and Megan's master bedroom, completely ignoring the closed door. Todd was a desperate, arrogant fool, drowning in massive syndicate debt, but he lacked the cold, methodical discipline required to procure and administer a rare chemical agent without exposing himself. The true architect of this execution was the usurper sleeping down the hall. Diane. I approached the heavy oak door of the guest suite she had boldly claimed for herself. The brass knob was locked firmly from the inside. I reached into my pocket and extracted a pair of tension wrenches and a standard rake pick I had salvaged from a specialized toolkit I always traveled with. I knelt on the thick carpet, pressing my ear against the cool wood of the doorframe. I could hear the slow, rhythmic, completely undisturbed breathing of the woman who was actively murdering my child. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a microscopic fraction of pressure with my left index finger. I inserted the rake pick directly above it, feeling the tiny brass pins binding stubbornly against the metal. 1, 2, 3. The pins set with tiny, practically inaudible clicks. I rotated the cylinder smoothly. The lock disengaged with a faint whisper. I turned the knob with excruciating slowness, pushing the door inward just enough to slip my body through the narrow gap. The suite smelled intensely of expensive lavender and bitter entitlement. Diane was asleep on the massive California king bed, buried under luxury down comforters purchased directly with my daughter's stolen money. She was sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of an apex predator entirely confident in her impending kill. I ignored her completely. My target was not the bed. My target was the ensuite bathroom. I glided across the plush carpet, stepping into the dark, tiled bathroom, and quietly pulled the heavy wooden door nearly shut behind me. I retrieved a small tactical penlight from my pocket, shielding the brilliant bulb with my fingers, so only a razor-thin sliver of illumination escaped into the room. I systematically evaluated the space. The sprawling marble vanity was littered with high-end cosmetics, imported anti-aging creams, and heavy crystal perfume bottles. Diane was a woman obsessed with preserving her own youth while actively accelerating the torturous death of my daughter. I ran my narrow beam of light across the glass shelves. A person trying to hide a highly illegal, colorless, odorless liquid would never use a random, suspicious container. They would hide it in plain sight somewhere they accessed every single day inside a vessel that no one else in the house would ever dare touch. My beam stopped dead on a heavy frosted glass bottle of exclusive overnight face serum, pushed slightly behind a row of common moisturizers. The specialized dropper cap was not perfectly aligned with the threading of the glass neck. It had been opened recently and hastily closed. I picked up the frosted bottle. It felt slightly too heavy for its size. I unscrewed the dropper cap and held it up to the sliver of light. The liquid inside was not a viscous, milky cosmetic serum. It was completely clear, possessing the exact thin consistency of purified water. I held it mere inches from my face. Thallium. I was holding the exact instrument of my daughter's torture. A sudden, overwhelming urge to walk back into the bedroom, pry Diane's jaw open, and pour the entire lethal contents down her throat violently gripped me. It would take only seconds. I could stand in the shadows and watch the poison scorch through her central nervous system, just as it had scorched through Megan's fragile body. But I forced my breathing to slow, burying the rage deep in my chest. Vengeance without absolute undeniable control was just reckless noise. If I killed her now, or even stole the vial, she would wake up, realize the murder weapon was missing, and instantly panic. Todd would panic. They would destroy the remaining financial evidence, hire aggressive defense attorneys, and drag the legal proceedings out for decades while playing the victims. I needed to let them execute their entire strategy. I needed them to walk straight into a courtroom, carrying the absolute certainty of their victory. I reached into the deep cargo pocket of my pants and pulled out a sterile medical-grade plastic syringe and a small collection vial I had taken from my travel medical kit. Operating entirely by the faint filtered sliver of my penlight, I carefully inserted the steel needle into the frosted glass bottle. I slowly drew back the plunger, extracting every single drop of the lethal thallium solution from the container. I meticulously transferred the poison into my secure collection vial, sealing the rubber stopper tight. This was the incontrovertible forensic evidence the police and the judge would need. This was the absolute physical proof of premeditated capital murder. But the glass bottle could not remain empty. Diane had confidently stated on the audio recordings I intercepted that she needed 3 more days of steady dosing to finalize the starvation narrative. If she woke up and found her hidden weapon totally empty, her entire timeline would instantly detonate. I pulled a small plastic bottle of standard saline solution from my kit. I systematically refilled the frosted glass bottle with the harmless salt water until it reached the exact original volume of the stolen poison. I screwed the dropper cap back on, intentionally leaving it slightly misaligned, matching the exact careless angle Diane had left it in. I placed the bottle back on the marble vanity, positioning it precisely behind the row of moisturizers. The trap was now fundamentally lethal to them, but completely invisible. Starting tomorrow morning, Diane would continue to meticulously dose Megan's discarded food and water bowls in the empty garage. She would smile with cold, arrogant satisfaction, entirely unaware that she was diligently administering harmless salt water to concrete dust. She would feel completely empowered, believing she was driving the final agonizing nails into my daughter's coffin. I slipped the sterile vial of pure thallium deep into my pocket, securing it against my leg. I turned off the penlight, plunging the bathroom back into total darkness. I exited the bathroom, moving silently past the sleeping usurper without making a single sound. I did not spare her a second glance. I stepped back out into the hallway and engaged the door lock with a quiet, satisfying click. The poison was successfully extracted, the timeline was fully secured, and the predators were completely blind. The sun would rise in exactly 3 hours, and they would gladly invite me to sit at their breakfast table, totally oblivious that the financial guillotine was already hovering directly above their arrogant necks. The morning sun poured through the massive bay windows of the kitchen. I walked in perfectly on cue. I shuffled my feet slightly against the hardwood floors to announce my arrival. I kept my shoulders rounded and my eyes wide with manufactured exhaustion. Todd sat at the sprawling marble island. He was staring deeply into a mug of black coffee. He looked like a man being crushed by an invisible weight. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent. The sheer terror of his impending financial ruin was leaking through his pores. Diane sat across from him. She was eating a piece of artisan toast with absolute serenity. She did not even bother to look up when I entered the room. I poured myself a cup of coffee with a trembling hand. I sat down heavily on a bar stool next to Todd. I let out a long breath and stared out the window toward the pristine suburban lawns. I asked him if there was any news from the mountain retreat. I asked if the doctors had called with an update on my little girl. Todd stiffened. He gripped his coffee mug so hard his knuckles turned white. He forced his facial muscles into a mask of deep sorrow and shook his head slowly. He told me the doctors were advising a total communication blackout. He said any outside interference could trigger a massive psychological setback for Megan. I nodded vigorously. I played the part of the desperate father clinging to the expertise of unseen professionals. I told him we had to trust the doctors. I said whatever it took to bring her back to us healthy and safe was worth it. Todd seized the opening immediately. He let out a ragged sigh and ran his hands through his unkempt hair. He told me the retreat was bleeding them dry. He said the specialized psychiatric care was costing thousands of dollars a day. He claimed his contracting business was already struggling, and these new medical bills were threatening to bankrupt them entirely. Diane finally looked up from her plate. She added her own layer of venom to the performance. She said it was a tragedy how much financial damage one person's mental instability could inflict on a family. She looked right at me and said Todd was sacrificing his entire future to clean up a mess he did not create. She wanted me to feel the guilt of my daughter's fabricated madness. She wanted me to feel utterly powerless. I shrank back in my chair. I lowered my gaze to my coffee. I apologized profusely. I told them I felt terrible that they were carrying this enormous burden all alone. I asked if there was absolutely anything I could do to help ease the pressure. Todd waited exactly 3 seconds before sliding a manila folder across the marble island. The trap was sprung. He opened the folder and pushed a single sheet of heavy legal paper toward me. He handed me a silver pen. He told me the insurance company was fighting the medical claims. He said they were refusing to cover the residential treatment program because they considered it an elective therapy rather than a psychiatric necessity. He told me the only way to force the insurance payout was to provide documented proof of a pre-existing condition. He said the lawyers drafted a simple statement for me to sign. He promised it was just bureaucratic red tape to get the hospital bills paid. I picked up the paper. My eyes scanned the paragraphs. My private security background had required me to read thousands of legal briefs and hostile extraction contracts. I decoded the document in less than 5 seconds. It was not an insurance form. It was a sworn legal affidavit. The document explicitly stated that I, as the biological father, was testifying under penalty of perjury that Megan had a lifelong history of severe violent psychological breaks. It stated that she was completely incapable of managing her own affairs. It stated that she posed an imminent danger to herself and others. It was a masterpiece of legal sabotage. Todd and Diane were not just trying to cover up a murder. They were laying the precise legal groundwork for a permanent emergency conservatorship. They needed my signature to bypass the ironclad clauses of the $4 million trust fund I had established for Megan. They needed the biological father to legally declare the primary beneficiary mentally incompetent. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the page. By signing this document, I would be handing Todd the exact ammunition he needed to seize total control of my daughter's estate. I would be validating every lie he planned to tell the probate judge. I let my hands shake visibly. I looked up at Todd with tears brimming in my eyes. I asked him if things were really this bad. I asked him if my little girl was truly this lost. Todd reached out and placed his hand over mine. He looked at me with an expression of profound, sickening empathy. He told me it was the only way to save her. He said we had to swallow our pride and do what was necessary to get her the help she desperately needed. Diane watched me from across the island like a hawk waiting for a rabbit to step into a snare. I did not hesitate a moment longer. I uncapped the silver pen. I let out a broken, pathetic sob. I told Todd that he was a good man for taking care of my daughter. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name in erratic, trembling cursive. I dated the document and slid it back across the marble surface. Todd exhaled a massive breath. The sheer physical relief radiating from his body was undeniable. He snatched the paper off the counter and closed it inside the manila folder. He thanked me. He said I was doing the right thing for Megan. Diane smiled a genuine, triumphant smile. She took a sip of her coffee, absolutely certain that she had just outsmarted everyone in the room. They believed they had just manipulated a frail old man into signing away his daughter's fortune. They believed the affidavit was their golden ticket to $4 million. They had absolutely no idea that I had deliberately signed my own name to hand them the rope they would use to hang themselves. The conflict was instantly chained forward. By giving them the signed perjury, I removed their final hesitation. They now possessed the legal weapon they needed to file the court injunction. They were now fully committed to the probate hearing. They could no longer back down or change their strategy. The affidavit was not their shield. It was my anchor. When I presented the forensic proof of the thallium poisoning and the severed padlock in open court, this very document would prove that Todd and Diane had committed felony fraud and premeditated perjury. I finished my coffee in silence. I smiled warmly at the two monsters sitting across from me. The legal guillotine was now perfectly positioned, and they had just eagerly placed their own heads on the chopping block. Todd caught me in the kitchen before the coffee had even finished brewing the next morning. The ink on the mental health affidavit I had signed for him was barely dry, and his inflated confidence was already warring with a deep, pathetic desperation. He leaned against the marble counter, drumming his fingers in a frantic, irregular rhythm. He cleared his throat twice before he actually spoke. He told me his contracting business had hit a temporary snag. He used empty corporate words like cash flow interruption and minor vendor delays. He painted a pitiful picture of a hard-working man just trying to keep his loyal crew paid while his poor wife was recovering at her mountain retreat. He finally swallowed his pride, or whatever fragile fragments of it remained, and asked me for a short-term bridge loan of $5,000. He promised to pay it back with interest the absolute second his next big housing project cleared the city permit office. $5,000 was nothing. It was pocket change in my world. But handing him cash would give him breathing room. And breathing room was the absolute last thing I intended to offer a man who had chained my daughter to a steel pipe. I put on my reading glasses. I let out a long, sympathetic sigh. I told him I would be absolutely thrilled to help him out. I watched his tense shoulders drop with immediate, pathetic relief. Then I set the hook. I told him that my pension was tight, and I just needed to make sure his business structure was solid before I transferred the funds. I offered to sit down with him, look over his ledgers, and maybe use my old overseas logistics experience to find some places where he could trim his monthly overhead. I smiled the gentle, harmless smile of a helpful, aging father. Todd hesitated. His eyes darted nervously toward the hallway. He absolutely did not want me looking at his numbers, but the desperation radiating off his skin was a physical stench. He needed that $5,000 to survive the week. He forced a stiff nod and went to his office to fetch his laptop. We sat side by side at the heavy dining room table. Todd pulled up his accounting software. He tried to quickly scroll past the master expense sheets, pointing out a few minor delayed invoices from local lumber suppliers. He thought I was just a tired old man who struggled to read a digital spreadsheet. He did not know that for 20 years my entire survival depended on auditing phantom supply chains and tracking smuggled goods through hostile war zones. I could spot a shell corporation and a money laundering loop faster than I could read a daily newspaper. I asked him to hand over the mouse. I told him my eyes tracked the columns better when I controlled the screen myself. He reluctantly let go, his breathing growing shallow. I opened his master ledger. The financial rot was immediately obvious. Todd was not running a legitimate contracting business. He was operating a desperate, bleeding financial sieve. I tracked the outbound payments across the last 6 months. I saw massive recurring wire transfers to a vendor listed only as Zenith Holdings. The material costs associated with this specific vendor were astronomically inflated. No legitimate builder pays a 400% markup on standard drywall and bulk copper wiring unless they are paying off something else entirely. I cross-referenced the dates of these specific payments. They occurred on the exact same day every single month without fail. They were not material purchases. They were extortionate interest payments. Todd was hemorrhaging cash to an aggressive underground lending syndicate. I kept my face entirely neutral. I asked him a mundane question about a tax deduction for his work trucks to keep him distracted while I dug deeper into the linked personal accounts. That was when I found Diane and her filthy fingerprints all over the records. Todd had foolishly linked his failing business accounts to the primary joint checking account he shared with my daughter. The digital ledger showed a devastating series of unauthorized rapid-fire withdrawals. Diane had systematically drained every single liquid dollar Megan possessed. She had siphoned the money in staggered increments to avoid triggering standard bank fraud alerts. She funneled the savings of my daughter directly into the failing business of Todd, just to cover the violent syndicate interest payments. The mother and son were parasites feeding off my daughter to keep the underground collectors away from their front door. I quickly ran the math in my head. The principal debt was staggering. Todd owed exactly $400,000 to men who did not send polite collection letters in the mail. The $5,000 he was begging me for was just a pathetic attempt to cover this week and the late fee penalty. He was a dead man walking. The walls were closing in on him rapidly, and the deadline for his absolute ruin was approaching fast. The pieces of their sick puzzle finally slammed together. That was why they were starving Megan in the garage. That was why they desperately needed me to sign the mental health affidavit. They needed to seize control of the $4 million trust fund to pay off the syndicate before the syndicate came to the house and broke the legs of Todd. I pushed the laptop back toward him. I took off my glasses and rubbed my eyes, playing the part of a confused senior citizen who could not make sense of the modern accounting software. I told him his business looked very complicated, but I trusted his judgment completely. I promised I would transfer the $5,000 to his personal account by the end of the day. Todd nearly collapsed over the table with gratitude. He thanked me profusely, calling me a lifesaver and a true blessing to their family. I smiled warmly and excused myself, claiming I needed to use the restroom to take my morning blood pressure medication. I walked into the guest bathroom and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I turned the sink faucet on full blast to mask the sound of my voice. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket and dialed Owen. He answered immediately, his voice sharp and ready. I gave him the exact routing numbers and the corporate shell name of Zenith Holdings. I told him I needed him to track the digital footprint back to the syndicate bosses who held the paper on the life of Todd. Owen was silent for a fraction of a second as he processed the massive sum involved. He asked if I wanted him to authorize a payment from my offshore accounts to clear the debt and eliminate the physical threat to the property. I looked at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. My eyes were cold and completely dead. I told Owen I did not want to pay the debt. I told him to activate my primary holding company. I ordered him to contact the syndicate directly and purchase the debt in its entirety. I wanted him to buy the paper at a premium so the syndicate would walk away happy and leave the contract entirely in our hands. The transaction would be completely invisible to Todd. He would simply receive a legal notice that his massive liability had been sold to a new extremely aggressive corporate entity. I was no longer just the grieving father sleeping in his guest room. Within the hour, I would secretly become his sole absolute creditor. I would hold the deed to his ruin in the palm of my hand. I shut off the water and unlocked the bathroom door. Todd was going to experience a level of sheer, unadulterated panic that he had never known. The pressure was about to shatter his fragile reality, and I was going to be sitting right there at his dining room table, offering him a warm smile while his entire world burned to ashes. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and watched the digital clock on my secure phone flip to 2 in the afternoon. The device vibrated once against my palm. It was Aaron. My corporate attorney did not waste breath on trivial greetings or pleasantries. He operated with the lethal precision of a guided missile and treated financial negotiations like active combat zones. He informed me that the underground syndicate holding the markers on Todd was surprisingly eager to liquidate the problem. They were violent, dangerous men, but they were also pragmatic businessmen. Dealing with a desperate, failing suburban contractor who constantly missed interest payments was a massive liability. Receiving a premium wire transfer from a massive, fully insulated corporate holding company was an absolute blessing. Aaron had finalized the transaction in less than 40 minutes. He paid them $450,000 in clean, untraceable corporate funds. In exchange, my holding company acquired every single legal and illegal marker Todd had ever signed. I was no longer merely a disappointed father-in-law staying in the guest room. I was now the absolute master of his entire financial existence. Every debt, every lien, every hidden liability belonged entirely to me. Aaron confirmed that the automated digital notices of the debt transfer had just been dispatched to the personal phone and business email of my son-in-law. I thanked Aaron and ended the call. I placed the phone carefully on the nightstand and slipped the flesh-colored earpiece back into my right ear canal. I did not have to wait long for the financial poison to take effect. The heavy front door of the house slammed open with enough force to rattle the framed pictures hanging on the hallway walls. Heavy, uncoordinated footsteps pounded across the hardwood floor. Through the audio feed transmitting directly into my ear, I could hear Todd gasping for air, as if he had just been submerged in a freezing lake. He stumbled into the kitchen, his breathing erratic and wet. Diane demanded to know what was wrong, her voice sharp with instant irritation at his lack of composure. Todd could barely form a coherent sentence. He choked out the words, telling his mother that they were completely finished. He said the syndicate had vanished. Diane snapped at him, demanding he make sense and lower his voice before he woke the old man. Todd explained through a series of ragged, hyperventilating gasps that he had just received a certified corporate summons on his phone. The thugs he owed money to had sold his entire debt portfolio to a massive, faceless private equity firm. The underground sharks were willing to break his legs for missing a payment, but this new corporate entity was equipped to completely obliterate his life legally. They had triggered an immediate non-negotiable acceleration clause. Todd wept openly as he told his mother the terms of the buyout. The new holding company demanded payment in full within 48 hours. If the funds did not clear their accounts by Friday afternoon, they would execute a total asset seizure. They would take his heavy business equipment, freeze his remaining bank accounts, and foreclose on the house immediately. They were going to leave him homeless, bankrupt, and facing severe federal fraud charges for the cooked ledgers he had used to secure the initial syndicate loans. Diane absorbed the terrifying information in absolute silence. The highly sensitive audio feed picked up the sound of a glass setting gently down on the marble island. She did not panic. She did not comfort her weeping son. Her mind, perfectly conditioned by decades of entitlement and manipulation, immediately began hunting for a new angle of attack. Todd continued to spiral into a complete breakdown. He asked his mother what they were going to do, begging her to find a loophole in the corporate paperwork. He reminded her that she had already drained all the liquid cash from his joint accounts with Megan just to pay the previous interest installments. There was absolutely nothing left to pawn or sell. They were backed into a corner with zero avenues of escape and a corporate executioner standing at the door. Diane finally spoke. Her voice was completely stripped of all maternal warmth. It was the voice of a cornered predator realizing it had to chew off its own leg to survive a steel trap. She told Todd to stop crying and start thinking like a man. She reminded him that there was exactly one asset left that could clear a $400,000 debt, and still leave them wealthy enough to never work another day in their miserable lives. She was talking about the trust fund. The $4 million account I had established for my daughter sat completely untouched, protected by layers of complex legal security. But those protections only applied as long as Megan was capable of managing her own estate. Todd stammered, his panic colliding violently with her lethal logic. He reminded his mother that the trust fund was completely inaccessible to them. He told her that Megan had to be physically present and to sign the disbursement authorizations, or she had to be legally declared incapacitated by a sitting judge. Diane cut him off with a surgical precision that made the blood in my veins run cold. She said the wellness retreat narrative was no longer sufficient. They had originally planned to wait 72 hours, letting the heavy metal poison slowly strip away the life of my daughter in the sweltering garage, allowing her to die of apparent exposure and starvation, so no forensic investigator would ever suspect foul play. They had planned to play the grieving, confused family who had simply lost track of a mentally unstable woman who wandered off. The sudden 48-hour debt deadline had completely incinerated that timeline. Diane laid out the brutal new reality. They could not wait 3 days for the thallium to finish its agonizing work. If they missed the Friday deadline, the corporate lawyers would seize the property, and the resulting financial audit would expose the missing funds, the cooked books, and ultimately the locked garage. They had to accelerate the execution immediately. Diane told her son that Megan could no longer simply be missing at a remote wellness center. She had to vanish permanently tonight. They had to dispose of her out in the deep woods, stage a tragic accident, or bury her where no hiker or police dog would ever catch the scent. Todd resisted, his innate cowardice flaring up. He told his mother he could not stomach the idea of actually moving the body, especially if she was still breathing and looking at him. He whined that he was not a murderer, completely ignoring the fact that he had kept his own wife chained to a steel plumbing pipe for weeks. Diane slapped him. The sharp, violent crack of her palm striking his cheek echoed clearly through my earpiece. She hissed at him, telling him he was already a murderer the second he agreed to buy the padlock, and looked the other way while she poured poison into the water supply. She ordered him to go to the hardware store and buy heavy-duty trash bags, industrial zip ties, and a shovel. She told him they were going out to the garage at exactly 2 a.m. They were going to end it. They were going to wrap Megan up in plastic, load her into the trunk of his heavy work truck, and drive her 3 counties over to a dense marshland Diane knew from her childhood. Once the body was gone, Diane explained the legal path to the money would be completely clear. They would use the mental health affidavit I had blindly signed for them earlier that morning. They would march into a probate court, waive my signed perjury in front of a sympathetic judge, and claim Megan had suffered a violent psychotic break, attacked them, and vanished into the dangerous wilderness. With my signature validating their lies as the concerned biological father, the judge would grant Todd immediate emergency conservatorship over his missing wife and her estate. The trust fund would be unlocked. The $400,000 debt would be paid off with millions to spare, and Diane would finally have unfettered access to the wealth she felt she deserved. The conflict had successfully chained forward, morphing from a slow, passive poisoning into an imminent, violent disposal. By purchasing the debt of my son-in-law, I had forced their hand. I had squeezed them into a psychological pressure cooker, shrinking their 72-hour window of comfort down to a mere 12 hours of sheer panic. They were no longer waiting for nature to take its course. They were actively preparing to carry a body out of a garage under the cover of darkness. They believed their revised plan was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation. They believed that tonight they would solve all their massive financial problems, eliminate the evidence of their cruelty, and secure their luxurious future. They did not know that the steel cage in the garage had been completely empty since the moment I arrived on the property. I sat in the dim light of the guest room, listening to them finalize the specific details of my daughter and her disposal, feeling the cold, absolute certainty of their impending destruction. The trap was fully loaded, the bait was set, and tonight, at 2 a.m, they were going to walk right into its teeth. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a faint green in the absolute darkness of the kitchen. It was exactly 2 in the morning. Alan stood perfectly still in the deep shadows beside the stainless steel refrigerator. He did not move a single muscle. He regulated his breathing to a slow and silent rhythm. Decades of operating in hostile foreign territories had taught him how to blend seamlessly into the background. He was a ghost in his own daughter's home. The heavy, oppressive humidity of the summer night pressed against the thick glass of the back door. Alan kept his eyes locked on the hallway leading to the stairs. He knew the crushing weight of the 48-hour corporate debt deadline was suffocating Todd. He knew the panic was currently paralyzing him in the master bedroom. But he also knew Diane would not let her son fail. She would force him to act. The syndicate debt Alan had secretly purchased was a ticking time bomb, and the only way they could defuse it was to unlock the $4 million trust fund. To do that, they needed to permanently erase Megan. Faint footsteps creaked on the hardwood stairs. Alan shifted his weight slightly deeper into the corner. He watched as 2 shadowy figures emerged from the hallway and stepped into the tiled mudroom. Todd appeared first. His posture was completely broken. He was carrying a heavy box of industrial contractor trash bags and a folding steel shovel. His hands were shaking so violently that the plastic-wrapped bags rustled loudly in the quiet house. He was sweating through his dark cotton shirt. Diane walked closely behind him. She moved with the cold and detached efficiency of a woman going out to do routine yard work. She held a heavy black tactical flashlight in her right hand. She whispered a sharp command to her son, telling him to stop shaking and open the door. Todd fumbled with the deadbolt. The brass mechanism clicked loudly. He pulled the door open and a wave of warm night air washed into the kitchen. Alan moved silently to the glass pane of the back door the moment they stepped outside. He tracked their movements across the dark suburban lawn. The moonlight cast long, distorted shadows behind them as they marched toward the detached garage. Todd walked with the heavy, dragging steps of a man approaching the gallows. He was terrified of what he was about to do, but he was infinitely more terrified of the corporate executioners who would seize his home by Friday. Diane stayed right at his shoulder, pushing him forward. They reached the side door of the garage. The pristine steel padlock Alan had purchased at the hardware store gleamed softly in the pale light. Todd set the heavy trash bags and the shovel down in the damp grass. He reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out a single brass key. He tried to insert the key into the padlock, but his hands were vibrating with so much adrenaline that he missed the slot entirely. The key slipped from his fingers and fell into the grass with a dull metallic clink. Diane let out a harsh, venomous hiss. She grabbed him by the shoulder and told him to pull himself together. She reminded him that their entire future depended on finishing this specific task tonight. Todd dropped to his knees and frantically patted the wet grass until his fingers brushed against the cold metal key. He stood back up and took a deep, ragged breath. He guided the key into the cylinder and turned it smoothly. The heavy steel shank popped open. Alan watched from the dark kitchen, completely unblinking. He knew exactly what was waiting behind that wooden door. He knew the cage was totally empty. He knew the floor had been scrubbed with industrial bleach. He watched Todd pull the padlock free and let it hang from the metal latch. Todd placed his hand flat against the heavy wooden door and pushed it inward. The hinges groaned softly in the quiet night. Todd stepped slowly into the suffocating pitch-black heat of the windowless room. Diane remained outside on the grass, sweeping the perimeter with her eyes to ensure no neighbors were watching from their bedroom windows. 5 agonizing seconds passed in absolute silence. 10 seconds ticked away. Alan waited for the psychological detonation. It erupted from the depths of the garage like a physical shockwave. It was not a word or a coherent sentence. It was a wet, suffocated sound of pure, unadulterated horror. Todd stumbled backward out of the doorway as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He collided heavily with the vinyl siding of the garage and slid down the wall. He gripped his own throat, hyperventilating violently. His chest heaved with massive, uncontrollable gasps. He looked like a man who had just looked directly into the eyes of a ghost. Diane spun around and aimed the heavy tactical flashlight directly at her son. She marched forward and grabbed his shirt collar, demanding to know what was wrong. Todd could not formulate a breath to speak. He simply raised a trembling finger and pointed blindly into the dark void of the open doorway. He choked on his own saliva and finally managed to whisper that she was gone. He said the chains were completely cut. He told his mother that the concrete floor was bleached clean and the room was totally empty. Diane dropped his collar. She snatched the flashlight and charged into the garage. The bright white beam of light sliced through the darkness. She swept the intense beam across the blank walls and down to the concrete floor. The light immediately illuminated the severed steel links of the heavy chain resting in a neat pile exactly where Alan had intentionally left them. The absolute, undeniable reality of the empty cage shattered her arrogant composure. She staggered backward out of the room. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin in the moonlight. She stared at the cut chains and then looked out into the surrounding darkness of the suburban yard. Todd was sobbing openly now. He remained curled on the damp grass, rocking back and forth. He told his mother that they were going to spend the rest of their lives in a federal prison. He repeated over and over that someone knew exactly what they had done. He said the police were probably already watching the house. His complete lack of emotional fortitude was pathetic to witness. Diane reached down and slapped him across the face with brutal, punishing force. The sharp sound snapped Todd out of his spiraling panic. She grabbed him by the arms and hauled him to his feet with surprising physical leverage. She ordered him to pick up the trash bags and the shovel immediately. She hissed that they could not afford to be seen loitering outside an open garage at 2 a.m. She told him to get back inside the house before a passing patrol car spotted them. Todd scrambled to gather the heavy plastic bags. They turned and stumbled back across the lawn, moving like hunted fugitives. Alan stepped away from the glass door. He turned and glided silently down the hallway, merging into the deep shadows of the guest room. He closed the door silently and sat on the edge of the mattress. He picked up his secure audio receiver and inserted the flesh-colored earpiece. The feed from the kitchen transmitters instantly flooded his ear with the chaotic sounds of their frantic retreat. Todd and Diane burst through the back door. The deadbolt slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. Todd dropped the plastic bags on the floor and collapsed against the kitchen island. The audio feed picked up the sound of him dry heaving into the stainless steel sink. He told his mother that they needed to pack their bags and flee the country. He said the syndicate debt was going to destroy them, and now the kidnapping charges were going to bury them forever. He was completely broken. Diane paced the hardwood floor in rapid, aggressive strides. Her mind was a tactical engine processing 1,000 variables a second. She absolutely refused to accept defeat. The 48-hour deadline from the corporate debt acquisition was still pressing a blade against her throat. She needed that $4 million trust fund to survive, and she was not going to let an empty garage stop her from claiming it. She spoke with a brutal, terrifying clarity that echoed through the earpiece. She told Todd to stop vomiting and listen to her very carefully. She explicitly stated that Megan could not have been rescued by an outside force. She reasoned that if the police or a private security team had found her, they would have already breached the front doors with an arrest warrant. Diane insisted that Megan must have somehow manipulated a weak link in the chain and managed to free herself. She calmly reminded her son that the heavy metal poison had already completely ravaged his wife's central nervous system. She stated clinically that a starving, poisoned woman who had been chained to a pipe for 3 weeks could not simply walk down the street to a police station. Diane declared with absolute chilling certainty that Megan must have crawled into the dense marshland woods behind the subdivision and died in the thick underbrush. Todd stopped heaving. He asked his mother what they were supposed to do now that they did not have a body to dispose of. He said the corporate lawyers were going to seize the house on Friday if they did not pay the $400,000. Diane delivered the ultimate strategic pivot. She told him they did not need a physical body to secure the money. She reminded him of the legal affidavit sitting in his home office desk, the document that Alan had blindly signed that very morning. The sworn testimony proving her lifelong history of severe mental instability and violent psychotic breaks. Diane said they were going to execute their backup protocol immediately. She ordered Todd to wash his face and try to get a few hours of sleep. She told him that at the exact moment the sun came up, he was going to call the local police department. She laid out the entire fabricated narrative without missing a single beat. Todd would report his wife missing. He would play the role of the devastated, terrified husband who woke up to find that his severely mentally ill wife had vanished into the dangerous wilderness during the night. He would hand the police the signed affidavit from her own father as absolute proof of her condition. Diane explained that once the official police report was filed, they would take that exact same paperwork directly to the county probate judge. They would demand an emergency hearing. They would use the father's signed perjury to secure immediate total conservatorship over her entire estate in order to fund the search and rescue efforts. Alan sat in the total darkness of the guest room listening to the final pieces of his trap snap perfectly into place. The conflict had chained forward flawlessly. The empty cage had not made them surrender. It had forced them to accelerate their legal fraud to a reckless speed. They were going to march into a court of law tomorrow morning and willingly commit felony perjury in front of a sitting judge. They were completely blinded by their crushing financial terror and their boundless, arrogant greed. Alan reached up and turned off the audio receiver. He laid his head back against the pillow. The silent reckoning was almost complete. They had built their own slaughterhouse, and tomorrow morning they were going to open the doors and walk right inside. The heavy oak front door chimed as it swung open to admit the architect of their final deception. Todd ushered the man into the living room with a frantic, nervous energy that made him look like a desperate bellboy. The lawyer introduced himself as Arthur Vance. He wore a suit that cost more than a standard mortgage payment and carried a leather briefcase that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and moral flexibility. I remained seated on the plush sofa with my shoulders slumped forward and my hands resting weakly on my knees. I observed Vance with the same clinical precision I once used to evaluate hostile negotiators in overseas conflict zones. His eyes swept across the room, taking immediate inventory of the expensive artwork and the imported rugs. He was a predator looking for a soft target. He completely dismissed me after a single passing glance. He saw exactly what Todd and Diane wanted him to see. He saw a broken, grieving father who was too old and too tired to understand the machinery of his own destruction. Diane glided into the living room carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee and porcelain cups. She played the role of the exhausted but steadfast matriarch to absolute perfection. She offered Vance a cup with a tragic, trembling smile. The lawyer accepted the coffee and sat down in the leather armchair directly across from me. He placed his briefcase on the glass coffee table and clicked the brass locks open. The sound echoed in the quiet room like the cocking of a loaded weapon. He told us that time was of the essence. He said he had reviewed the financial structure of my daughter's estate and the specific parameters of the $4 million trust fund. He spoke in a smooth, rehearsed cadence designed to make theft sound like an act of profound mercy. Vance explained that seizing control of an irrevocable trust was normally a process that took months of grueling litigation and mandatory psychiatric evaluations. He said the courts heavily favored the primary beneficiary and protected their assets behind ironclad legal walls. Todd began to sweat visibly. He shifted his weight on the sofa next to his mother. He knew he did not have months to wait. He did not even have days. The faceless corporate entity that had just purchased his $400,000 syndicate debt had given him exactly 48 hours to pay in full or face total ruin. If the lawyers seized the house on Friday, the police would inevitably search the property and find the empty cage in the garage. Todd was drowning in invisible terror. Diane reached out and placed a calming hand on the knee of her son. She looked at the lawyer and calmly stated that they did not have months to wait, while Megan wandered the dangerous wilderness in a state of violent psychosis. Vance smiled a predatory grin. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the manila folder Todd had given him earlier that morning. He told Diane that the normal rules did not apply to this specific situation. He slid the folder across the glass table and opened it to reveal the document I had signed just hours ago. He tapped his manicured finger directly on my signature. He announced that this specific affidavit was the golden key that unlocked every single door in the probate court. Vance explained the mechanics of the emergency injunction with ruthless clarity. He said the sworn testimony of a biological father stating that his daughter suffered from a lifelong history of violent psychological breaks completely bypassed the need for a standard medical evaluation. Because I had legally declared under penalty of perjury that Megan was an imminent danger to herself and entirely incapable of managing her own affairs, the court would view this as a matter of immediate life and death. The lawyer said the judge would be forced to act to protect the missing woman and her assets. He intended to file an emergency ex parte motion for temporary conservatorship. The motion would legally strip Megan of all her financial rights and transfer absolute control of the $4 million trust fund directly to Todd. I stared at the piece of paper resting on the glass table. I let the silence stretch for several long, agonizing seconds. I thought about the day I opened that trust account. I established the fund the morning after my wife lost her battle with cancer. It was designed to be an impenetrable fortress to protect my little girl from the vultures and the parasites of the world. It was structured to keep men exactly like Todd and Vance locked out forever. But the single vulnerability in that fortress was an emergency medical override signed by next of kin. By handing them this fabricated testimony, I had willingly handed them the combination to the vault. I watched the greedy anticipation radiating from Todd and Diane. They were practically vibrating with the thrill of their impending wealth. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I brought my trembling hands up to cover my face. I squeezed my eyes shut tight until the pressure forced genuine tears to pool in the corners. I let out a wretched, pathetic sob that seemed to tear through my chest. I rocked back and forth on the sofa, playing the role of a man completely shattered by grief. I cried out for my daughter, begging the empty room to bring her back to me. I looked at the lawyer through my tears and asked him if this piece of paper was really going to help find my little girl. I asked him if taking control of her money would allow us to hire private investigators and search teams to bring her home before she hurt herself in the woods. Todd moved quickly to capitalize on my performance. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders and pulled me into a rigid, uncomfortable embrace. He patted my back and told me that everything was going to be all right. He promised me that he would spend every single penny of that trust fund if he had to, just to bring his beloved wife back home safely. The sheer volume of lies spilling from his mouth was staggering. He was a coward comforting the man he believed he was robbing. Vance cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He said the legal maneuver was absolutely guaranteed to work, but he warned that the expedited process required significant capital up front. He explained that bribing the court clerks to jump the scheduling line and paying his own exorbitant emergency retainer fees would cost $25,000. He said he needed the funds cleared immediately before he could walk into the courthouse and file the injunction. The physical reaction from Todd was immediate. The blood drained out of his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He pulled his arm away from my shoulders and stared at the lawyer in absolute panic. $25,000 was an impossible mountain for a man whose bank accounts had already been drained to pay off illegal syndicate interest. Diane stiffened beside him, her mind racing to find a solution to this sudden financial roadblock. They were inches away from $4 million, but they could not afford to open the door. I did not let them suffer the panic for long. I reached a trembling hand into the inner pocket of my tweed jacket and pulled out my leather checkbook. I wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand, but I told Todd that he had already sacrificed enough for my family. I said it was my duty as a father to bear the financial burden of finding my daughter. I uncapped my pen and wrote out a check for $25,000 with slow, deliberate strokes. I signed my name at the bottom and tore the slip of paper from the booklet. I held it out toward Todd. I told him to take the money and use it to save our little girl. Todd snatched the check from my trembling fingers with a speed that betrayed his massive greed. His eyes scanned the numbers and the signature. A wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over him. The tension melted out of his shoulders. He looked up at me with an expression of manufactured gratitude and thanked me profusely. He called me a true savior. He handed the check across the glass table to the lawyer. Vance inspected the draft, smiled a thin, greedy smile, and tucked it securely into his leather briefcase. Diane stood up and offered to show the lawyer to the door. Todd stood up right behind her to follow them into the foyer. I remained seated on the sofa, wiping my eyes with a handkerchief. As Todd turned his back to me, I caught his reflection perfectly framed in the large antique mirror hanging above the fireplace. The mask of the grieving, terrified husband completely vanished the absolute second he thought I could no longer see his face. A massive, arrogant grin stretched across his features. He rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and silently mouthed the words, "Poor old fool," to his mother. Diane did not reprimand him. She simply offered a cold, triumphant smirk in return. They truly believed they had conquered the world. They believed they had successfully murdered a woman, erased the evidence, and tricked a wealthy, senile old man into financing their legal defense. Vance stepped into the foyer and pulled his phone from his pocket. He told them he was going to call the scheduling clerk immediately to lock in the emergency hearing. He paced near the front door, speaking in hushed, rapid tones to whoever was on the other end of the line. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Vance ended the call and turned back to Todd and Diane with a look of absolute victory. He announced that the pieces were officially set. The clerk had accepted the premise of the emergency and bumped their case to the absolute front of the line. The judge had granted an expedited hearing for the very next morning at 9:00 sharp. Vance shook hands with Todd and walked out the front door. The heavy oak slammed shut behind him, leaving a thick, heavy silence in the house. Todd let out a loud, sharp bark of laughter. He grabbed his mother by the shoulders and spun her around in a brief celebratory dance. They whispered excitedly to each other in the hallway, convinced that their nightmare was finally over. The syndicate debt would be paid by Friday. The trust fund would be theirs by noon tomorrow. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty coffee cups on the glass table. I listened to their muffled celebrations echoing from the hallway. My tears dried instantly. My breathing slowed and my heart rate dropped to a calm, rhythmic baseline. The bait had been taken. The check I had just written was not a lifeline to save them from drowning. It was the final nail in their coffins. By cashing that check and using it to file the fraudulent injunction, they were officially cementing their criminal conspiracy in the permanent, unalterable records of a federal court. They were walking into the courthouse tomorrow morning, completely blind, entirely convinced of their own genius. They had no idea that the silent old man sitting on their sofa was the same faceless corporate entity that owned their entire financial existence. The emergency hearing was no longer a legal proceeding. It was an ambush. And tomorrow at 9:00, I was going to drop the sky on their heads. The heavy oak doors of the county probate court closed with a dull, hollow thud that sealed us inside the sterile room. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and aged legal paper. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick frosted glass of the high windows, casting a pale, unfeeling light across the polished mahogany benches. Todd walked toward the witness stand with the slow, hesitant steps of a man carrying an unbearable tragedy on his shoulders. He raised his right hand and placed his left hand flat against the leather-bound Bible resting on the wooden podium. He swore under penalty of perjury to tell the whole absolute truth. He sat down and immediately launched into a masterpiece of desperate theatrical deception. He let his shoulders collapse inward. He stared down at his trembling hands and allowed his voice to crack perfectly on cue. He squeezed his eyes shut until forced tears began to spill over his lower lids and run down his pale cheeks. He told the presiding judge a meticulously crafted story of a devoted husband watching his beloved wife slowly lose her mind. Todd described a fictitious night of sheer, unimaginable terror. He claimed that Megan had woken up shortly after midnight, screaming violently at shadows and fighting off invisible attackers in the dark. He said he tried to hold her and calm her down, but she possessed a sudden manic strength. He lied to the court with absolute conviction, stating that she broke away from his grasp, tore open the back door, and vanished into the dense, treacherous marshland behind their suburban subdivision. He pulled a crumpled tissue from his pocket and wiped his face, playing the role of a man completely broken by circumstances beyond his control. He choked back a manufactured sob as he begged the judge for immediate emergency assistance. He claimed that his local contracting business was currently struggling through a temporary cash flow interruption, and he was entirely out of liquid funds. He stated that the only way to save his missing wife was to gain immediate, unmitigated access to her $4 million trust fund. He pleaded that he needed the capital by noon to hire private helicopters, tracking dogs, and specialized search and rescue teams before the harsh elements claimed her life in the deep woods. He painted himself as a desperate protector, willing to sacrifice everything to bring his family back together, while secretly needing the money to pay off a violent underground syndicate by Friday afternoon. Todd stepped down from the wooden box, wiping his eyes and keeping his head bowed in a display of profound sorrow. Diane was called to the stand next. She moved across the carpeted floor with the serene, untouchable dignity of a strong matriarch holding her devastated family together. She placed her manicured hand on the Bible and swore the exact same legally binding oath as her son. She sat in the leather chair and adjusted her posture. She did not shed a single tear. She played the role of the pragmatic anchor, offering cold, hard facts to support a tragic reality. She corroborated every single lie her son had just delivered to the silent courtroom. She testified under the strict penalty of perjury that Megan had grown increasingly violent and completely unstable over the past several months. She described entirely fabricated incidents of extreme paranoia and severe physical aggression toward Todd. She stated firmly and clearly that my daughter was a profound danger to herself and absolutely incapable of surviving on her own in the world. Diane was completely ruthless in her execution. She looked directly into the eyes of the judge and told him that granting Todd immediate emergency conservatorship was not just a bureaucratic legal formality, but a severe moral imperative. She pointed a steady finger toward the stack of documents resting on the elevated mahogany bench. She reminded the court that they did not have to rely solely on her testimony. She stated that even the biological father of the missing woman had recognized the terrifying deterioration of her mind. She explicitly referenced the sworn affidavit I had signed in their kitchen just 24 hours prior. Diane sat back in the heavy wooden chair, radiating an aura of total, absolute invincibility. She believed she had just orchestrated the perfect, flawless crime. She had successfully locked the judge into a legal corner, using my own fabricated grief as the key. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the thick files spread out before him. The silence in the courtroom stretched into a long, agonizing pause. He nodded slowly as his eyes scanned the heavy legal paper bearing my forged testimony. He was completely convinced by the theatrical display of grief and the overwhelming documentary evidence they had manufactured. He looked down at Todd, sitting at the petitioner's table next to his corrupt, expensive lawyer, and offered his deepest, sincere sympathies for the terrible tragedy that had befallen their peaceful home. He stated in a solemn, measured tone that the court possessed a fundamental legal duty to protect vulnerable individuals who could no longer protect themselves from harm. He arranged his papers into a neat, orderly stack and reached for his heavy wooden gavel. He announced to the silent room that he was fully prepared to grant the emergency ex parte motion. He was ready to strike the wooden block legally, strip my daughter of her financial autonomy, and hand absolute unmitigated control of a $4 million estate directly into the hands of the very man who had chained her to a steel plumbing pipe. Todd let out a long, ragged breath of relief that rustled the papers on his table. The crushing weight of the corporate debt deadline lifted from his shoulders. Diane allowed a microscopic, triumphant smirk to touch the corners of her mouth. The brutal syndicate loan was practically paid in full. Their lavish, arrogant future was entirely secured. They had successfully navigated the rigid legal system and were seconds away from stealing a massive fortune in broad daylight. They were completely blinded by their own arrogance. The judge paused with his hand hovering just inches above the striking block. He looked across the silent expanse of the courtroom toward the gallery, where I was sitting alone in the second row. He addressed me directly as the grieving biological father of the missing woman. He asked in a soft, respectful tone if I had any final objections or statements I wished to add before he entered the emergency ruling into the official permanent court record. Todd turned his head to look back at me. He wore an expression of manufactured pity that barely concealed his profound predatory greed. Diane did not even bother to turn around in her chair. She assumed I was a completely broken, senile old man. She expected me to weep openly, nod my head in tragic agreement, and blindly validate their entire fabricated narrative. I placed my hands flat against the polished wooden bench in front of me. I pushed myself up from the seat. The frail, exhausted posture of the defeated elderly father evaporated the absolute instant my heavy leather boots took the full weight of my body. My spine aligned into a rigid, perfect vertical column. I rolled my shoulders back and let the heavy manufactured exhaustion drain entirely out of my muscles. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. The pathetic, grieving old man they thought they had manipulated so easily ceased to exist in that sterile room. I stepped out from behind the wooden partition and began to walk down the center aisle toward the elevated bench. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, and completely silent on the carpeted floor. The sudden predatory shift in my physical presence sucked all the breathable air out of the room. Todd felt the intense atmospheric change instantly. His fake, sympathetic smile collapsed into a tight mask of pure, unfiltered confusion. The color began to drain rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. The corrupt lawyer sitting next to him shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit, suddenly realizing that his easy payday was evaporating before his eyes. Diane finally turned her head to look back at me. The triumphant, arrogant smirk vanished from her lips, as if it had been wiped away by a physical blow. Her eyes widened in sudden terror as she registered the total, absolute absence of grief on my face. She saw the cold, dead calculation of a man preparing to execute a hostile target. I approached the heavy wooden gate that separated the public gallery from the legal floor. I stopped walking and looked directly up at the judge. My voice dropped from the weak, trembling whisper of a frightened father into an icy flat and absolute authoritative register. I told the court that I had a profound, undeniable objection to every single word that had been spoken in the room. I stated clearly and without a fraction of emotion that the two people sitting at the petitioner's table were not grieving family members trying to save a lost woman, but desperate criminals attempting to finalize a lethal financial fraud. The trap had closed, and there was absolutely no escape. The heavy wooden gate swung open with a soft click. I stepped onto the polished floor of the legal arena. The judge looked down at me with a mixture of mild confusion and judicial impatience. He expected a weeping father pleading for a miracle. I gave him a soldier executing a mission. I walked directly to the elevated mahogany bench and stopped exactly 2 feet from the wooden partition. I did not ask for permission to speak. I simply stated that the court was being used as a weapon to finalize a murder. The sheer conviction in my voice caused the court reporter to stop typing for a fraction of a second. The judge lowered his reading glasses and stared at me. He warned me that this was a formal proceeding and emotional outbursts would not be tolerated. I told him there was absolutely no emotion in what I was about to present. I told him there was only empirical forensic truth. I reached into the deep right pocket of my wool coat. I pulled out the shattered industrial padlock. I set it down on the polished wood of the bench. The heavy steel landed with a blunt, dense thud that echoed into the high vaulted ceiling. I pointed to the severed shackle. I told the judge that this specific lock had secured the side door of the detached garage at the residence of my son-in-law. I explained that it was not purchased to protect expensive tools or landscaping equipment. I told the court that for the last 3 weeks it had been used to imprison my daughter. I explained that she was not wandering the wilderness in a state of violent psychosis. She was chained to a copper plumbing pipe on a bare concrete floor. Todd let out a strangled gasp from the table behind me. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the judge. I reached into my left pocket and extracted a thick manila envelope bearing the crimson seal of an independent toxicology laboratory. I opened the flap and withdrew the clinical report. I slid the crisp white papers across the wood so they rested perfectly aligned next to the broken padlock. I told the judge to look at the highlighted chemical compounds. I explained that the document proved systemic prolonged exposure to liquid thallium. I told the court that the predators sitting behind me had methodically dosed the drinking water of my daughter. I explained how the heavy metal poison was specifically chosen because it flawlessly mimics the symptoms of a severe psychological breakdown. It causes paranoia, hair loss, and muscular tremors. They used a chemical weapon to manufacture a medical illusion. They starved her in a sweltering concrete box to accelerate her physical collapse. They created a fake madness to justify stealing her money. Arthur Vance jumped up from his leather chair. The expensive lawyer threw his hands in the air and began shouting objections. He stammered that this was an outrage and a complete violation of judicial procedure. He demanded that the judge strike my testimony from the record and order the bailiffs to remove me from the courtroom. The judge raised his wooden gavel and slammed it down with a thunderous crack. He ordered Vance to sit down and remain completely silent. The judge looked at the laboratory seal on the toxicology report and then looked back at me. He asked me why a husband would subject his own wife to such elaborate and agonizing torture. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy corporate parchment. It was the deed of assignment from Zenith Holdings. I laid it gently on top of the toxicology report. I told the judge that the answer was always money. I explained that Todd was not a struggling contractor facing a minor cash flow interruption. He was a degenerate gambler and a fraud who owed exactly $400,000 to a violent underground lending syndicate. I told the court that his mother Diane had already drained every liquid asset my daughter possessed just to cover the extortionate interest payments. They were completely bankrupt and facing an immediate physical threat from men who break bones to collect their debts. I told the judge that they needed total unmitigated control of the $4 million trust fund to save their own lives. I paused and finally turned to look at Todd and Diane. They were frozen in a state of absolute catatonic horror. The blood had vanished from their faces. They looked like corpses propped up in chairs. I turned my attention back to the judge. I told him that the syndicate no longer owned the debt. I explained that exactly 18 hours ago, a private corporate entity had purchased the entire debt portfolio for a massive premium. I told the judge that the new holding company had triggered a 48-hour acceleration clause demanding payment in full by Friday afternoon, or they would seize the property and execute a forensic audit. I pointed a steady finger at the corporate deed on the bench. I announced that I was the sole owner of that holding company. I told the court that I was the invisible executioner who had bought their debt. I had squeezed them into a 12-hour window of pure panic to force them to make a fatal mistake. Todd began to physically vibrate. His breathing became incredibly loud and erratic, filling the quiet room with the sounds of a man suffocating on his own terror. Diane grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging deep into his suit jacket, but he could not be calmed. The flawless, aristocratic mask she wore had completely melted away, revealing the frantic, trapped animal underneath. Vance slumped back in his chair, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that his clients were not going to pay him a single dime. He realized he was sitting next to two people who were about to be arrested for capital crimes. The judge stared at the three items on his bench: the padlock, the medical report, and the corporate deed. He looked at me with a profound gravity. He asked me if I had absolute definitive proof that Todd and Diane were responsible for the poisoning and the imprisonment. He stated that the documents proved the circumstances, but he needed undeniable proof of their direct involvement. I did not offer a verbal response. I reached into my pocket one final time and extracted my secure, encrypted mobile phone. I swiped the screen to bypass the lock and opened the audio file I had captured just hours ago. I set the internal volume to its absolute maximum capacity. I placed the black device on the wooden podium directly in front of the court reporter. I pressed play. The crystal-clear digital recording filled the cavernous courtroom. The acoustics of the high ceilings amplified the voices, making them sound terrifyingly intimate. The entire room listened in dead silence as the audio feed began. It started with the sound of Todd hyperventilating in his kitchen. Then the cold, mechanical voice of Diane echoed off the mahogany walls. The court heard her tell her son to stop crying and start thinking like a man. They heard her explicitly declare that the wellness retreat narrative was no longer viable because of the corporate debt deadline. They heard her state that they could not wait 3 days for the thallium to finish its agonizing work. The judge closed his eyes as the audio played the exact moment Diane ordered Todd to gather heavy trash bags and an industrial shovel. The courtroom listened in absolute horror as the mother and son finalized their plan to wrap my daughter in plastic, load her into a work truck, and bury her deep in the marshlands, where no police dog would ever find her. The recording captured the slap. It captured Diane calling Todd a murderer. It captured the exact moment they realized the garage was empty and pivoted to their backup plan of committing perjury in this very courtroom. The audio was irrefutable. It was a perfectly preserved monument to their supreme cruelty and their monumental arrogance. I pressed stop on the phone. The sudden silence in the courtroom was heavier than a lead blanket. The judge stared at the table with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her hands hovering frozen over her keyboard. The psychological pressure of the moment was simply too massive for a weak mind to endure. The absolute certainty of federal prison and public ruin shattered the fragile remaining pieces of sanity inside Todd. He snapped. He leapt out of his leather chair, knocking it backward onto the carpet. He pointed a violently shaking finger at me. He screamed at the top of his lungs that the audio was a complete fabrication. He yelled that I was a liar and a monster trying to frame him. His voice cracked as he shrieked that computer software had generated the entire conversation. He was flailing wildly, grabbing at the edge of his table. Diane hissed at him to shut his mouth, but he was completely beyond her control. Todd looked wildly between the judge and me. Spit flew from his lips as he screamed his final defense. He demanded that I prove the audio was real. He demanded that I prove my daughter was even alive. He shouted that the cage in the garage had been completely empty when he went out there. He yelled that the chains were cut and she was gone. He screamed that a starving, poisoned woman could not possibly survive on her own. He demanded that the judge force me to produce her body because he knew she had crawled into the woods to die. The words echoed into the vaulted ceiling and slowly faded away. Todd stood panting, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with desperate adrenaline. He waited for a victory that would never come. It took exactly 3 seconds for the reality of his own words to catch up with his panicked brain. He looked at the judge. The judge was staring at him with a cold, absolute finality. Todd looked at his mother. Diane had buried her face in her hands, knowing her son had just driven the final nail into their coffins. Todd had just stood in open court on the official legal record and screamed that the cage in the garage was empty. He had screamed that the chains were cut. He had screamed that a poisoned, starving woman had crawled into the woods to die. In his desperate, frantic attempt to prove the audio was fake, he had inadvertently confirmed every single horrific detail of the recording. He had willingly confessed to false imprisonment, kidnapping, and attempted murder in front of a sitting judge. He had sealed his own fate with his own tongue. I picked up my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked at Todd with a hollow expression. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply told him that my daughter was resting safely in a private medical facility, surrounded by a team of specialists who were flushing his poison out of her veins. I told him she was going to live a long, beautiful life funded by the millions he had tried to steal. I turned my back on him entirely. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open as 4 armed bailiffs moved rapidly down the aisle toward the table. The trap had executed flawlessly. The silent reckoning was over. The echo of my final words had barely settled against the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom when the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery groaned in protest. It was not a polite, hesitant entry. It was a deliberate, forceful breach that shattered the sterile silence of the legal proceeding. Every head in the room swiveled toward the sound. The court reporter gasped, her hands freezing mid-keystroke over her stenograph machine. The armed bailiffs instinctively shifted their weight, their hands dropping toward the heavy black holsters resting on their duty belts. The judge peered over his thick reading glasses, his brow furrowed in utter outrage at the sudden, unapproved interruption of his courtroom. But the judicial outrage dissolved into absolute paralyzed shock the instant the figures stepped through the threshold and into the pale morning light filtering through the frosted windows. Owen led the vanguard. My old logistics contact did not wear a suit. He wore a dark tactical jacket and moved with the silent, lethal grace of a man who had navigated minefields and hostile extraction zones for decades. He possessed a gravity that demanded immediate, unquestioning compliance. His eyes swept the room in a fraction of a second, assessing every threat, every exit, and every individual present. He stepped aside, holding the heavy wooden door open with one powerful arm, making way for the procession that followed. The rhythmic, mechanical squeak of rubber wheels against the polished hardwood floor began to echo down the center aisle. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate sound that seemed to suck all the breathable oxygen out of the cavernous space. A medical wheelchair emerged from the shadows of the antechamber and crossed into the light. My breath caught in my throat. I had maintained absolute cold control for days, operating as a machine of pure vengeance. But seeing her now in the light of day fractured my rigid exterior. It was Megan, my little girl. She was flanked on either side by a team of private, highly specialized medical professionals wearing sterile scrubs and carrying portable diagnostic monitors. An intricate web of intravenous lines snaked from hidden pouches down into her bruised forearms, delivering the continuous, aggressive loop of binding antidotes and hydration that was actively pulling her back from the brink of death. The sharp, clinical smell of medical alcohol and sterile saline washed over the scent of aged paper and floor wax. She looked impossibly frail. The vibrant, energetic woman I had raised was buried beneath weeks of systematic starvation and the ravaging effects of the heavy metal toxicity. Her skin was the color of old parchment, drawn tight over her cheekbones. Her hair, once thick and radiant, hung limp and thinned around her hollow face. Yet despite the devastating physical toll of the thallium coursing through her veins, she was not broken. She was sitting completely upright. Her spine was rigid. Her hands gripped the padded armrests of the wheelchair with a fierce, undeniable determination. The fire in her eyes had not been extinguished in that sweltering dark garage. It had been concentrated into a sharp, burning laser of pure, unadulterated survival. She was not a victim being wheeled in for pity. She was the absolute, undeniable truth entering the room to execute her tormentors. I turned my gaze away from my daughter and locked my eyes onto the petitioner's table. The physical and psychological destruction of my son-in-law was a spectacle of absolute, pathetic ruin. Todd was standing right next to the heavy wooden chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent, suffocating scream. His brain was violently rejecting the impossible reality rolling down the center aisle. He had stood under oath just minutes prior, weeping crocodile tears, swearing to a sitting judge that his wife was hopelessly insane and lost in the treacherous wilderness. He had bet his entire life, his freedom, and his very soul on the absolute certainty that she was dead or dying. Seeing her breathing conscious and moving toward him was a psychological detonation he could not survive. The last remaining threads of his fragile sanity snapped simultaneously. His knees simply ceased to function. They buckled beneath him with a sickening lack of resistance. Todd collapsed forward, his chin striking the edge of the mahogany table with a dull, hollow impact. His heavy binders and perfectly forged legal documents scattered across the carpet like dead leaves in a hurricane. He slid down the side of the table and crumpled onto the floor in a miserable, quivering heap. He did not try to stand back up. He did not try to explain. He just curled his body inward, clutching his own hair, letting out a series of high, whimpering, animalistic sounds. He was drowning in a puddle of his own making, suffocated by the sheer magnitude of his impending permanent incarceration. The $400,000 syndicate debt he had desperately tried to pay with my daughter's life was now the least of his problems. Diane did not collapse. The wealthy aristocratic matriarch who had orchestrated this entire lethal fraud did not surrender to panic or grief. She possessed the cold, calculating instincts of an apex predator, and the absolute second she saw the wheelchair, those instincts screamed at her to flee. The mask of the grieving, supportive mother-in-law evaporated entirely, leaving behind a frantic, cornered beast. She did not look at her son weeping on the floor. She did not look at the judge. She looked directly at the side exit door, located just 15 feet away near the jury box. She moved with sudden, explosive violence. Diane shoved her expensive leather chair backward so hard it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. She bolted toward the heavy wooden exit doors, her imported designer heels scrambling for traction against the polished wood. It was an act of pure, mindless desperation, a pathetic attempt to outrun the consequences of her own horrific cruelty. But she had severely underestimated the environment. The courtroom was no longer a civilian space. It was a secured perimeter. The armed bailiffs stationed around the room had already shifted their posture the moment Owen breached the rear doors. The instant Diane made her sudden, aggressive movement, the officers reacted with trained clinical precision. 2 heavy-set deputies intercepted her before she even made it halfway to the exit. They did not use gentle restraint. They collided with her, their massive frames easily absorbing her frantic momentum. Diane shrieked a chaotic, unhinged sound that echoed terribly in the austere room. She flailed her arms, scratching and clawing at the uniform shirts of the officers, completely losing whatever shred of dignity she possessed. The bailiffs spun her around, forcing her arms behind her back with brutal, efficient leverage. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs locking around her wrists punctuated her screams. They pinned her firmly against the mahogany wall, completely immobilizing the woman who had tried to murder my child for a bank account. The absolute chaos that had briefly engulfed the front of the courtroom settled into a new, heavy silence as Owen pushed the wheelchair to a smooth halt, precisely in the center of the room, directly facing the elevated bench. The medical staff fanned out, maintaining their vigilant watch over the monitors, creating an impenetrable barrier around my daughter. The corrupt probate lawyer representing Todd had pressed his back flat against his chair, completely mute, realizing he was an unwitting accessory to attempted capital murder. The judge was standing behind his desk, his hands gripping the edges of the wood, his face a portrait of absolute, unvarnished astonishment. He looked down at Todd, whimpering on the floor, then to Diane, struggling fruitlessly against the steel cuffs pinning her to the wall. And finally, he rested his gaze on the pale, frail woman sitting in the wheelchair. He slowly lowered the wooden gavel that just moments ago was prepared to sign away her life. Megan did not look at the judge. She turned her head slowly, the effort clearly taxing her ravaged muscles, and looked directly down at her husband. Todd felt the weight of her gaze. He slowly raised his head from the carpet, his face stained with tears and terror. He looked up at the woman he had promised to love and protect, the woman he had chained to a steel pipe in the dark to die of thirst and poison. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the slow, steady hum of the medical equipment keeping her alive. Megan took a deep, rattling breath. Her vocal cords had been damaged by weeks of screaming for help in an empty garage. But when she spoke, her voice was completely steady. It carried the icy, unyielding weight of absolute truth. She did not yell. She did not cry. She looked her husband dead in the eye and spoke with a terrifying, piercing clarity that sliced through every single lie they had manufactured. She said, "He locked me in the dark for 3 weeks." She shifted her gaze away from the pathetic man on the floor and leveled her eyes directly at the struggling woman pinned against the wall. Diane stopped fighting the bailiffs the instant Megan looked at her. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the final pieces of the narrative slammed into place. My daughter took another slow, deliberate breath, summoning the last reserves of her strength, and delivered the final devastating blow that would lock them away for the rest of their natural lives. She said she poisoned me. The words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable, sealing the tomb that Todd and Diane had arrogantly built for themselves. The silent reckoning was over, and the complete restoration of our family had officially begun. The echo of my daughter's voice hung in the sterile air of the courtroom for a fraction of a second before the entire legal apparatus violently corrected its course. The absolute, undeniable truth of her words shattered the suffocating atmosphere. The presiding judge stood frozen behind his elevated mahogany bench. His face morphed from a portrait of judicial confusion into a mask of pure, unadulterated wrath. He had been minutes away from handing over a $4 million estate to a pair of ruthless predators based on an elaborate mountain of perjury. He looked at the shattered industrial padlock resting on his desk. He looked at the clinical toxicology report detailing the systematic heavy metal poisoning. He looked at the frail, shivering woman sitting in the medical wheelchair surrounded by intravenous lines. And then he looked at the two monsters who had orchestrated the entire lethal deception. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the striking block with a violent, thunderous force that made the wooden floorboards vibrate. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot. He did not simply call for order. He completely annihilated the emergency probate hearing. He projected his voice across the room with a terrifying, furious authority, ordering the immediate suspension of all civil proceedings. He pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at Todd and Diane. He commanded the 4 armed court bailiffs to place them both under immediate arrest. He listed the charges with a booming cadence that left no room for misinterpretation or legal maneuvering. Attempted capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, felony false imprisonment, and multiple counts of severe felony perjury. The physical response from the courtroom security was instantaneous and absolutely uncompromising. The 2 deputies who had already pinned Diane against the mahogany wall wrenched her arms aggressively backward. The heavy steel ratchets of the handcuffs bit deeply into her wrists. She let out a sharp, indignant hiss, but the officers offered her 0 quarter. They slammed her face first against the polished wood, frisking her for weapons with a rough, clinical efficiency that entirely stripped away her wealthy, aristocratic facade. The woman who had spent months plotting the slow, agonizing starvation of my child was now nothing more than a common violent felon being processed for maximum security holding. She twisted her neck to look back at the room, her eyes wide with the sudden, visceral understanding that her life was functionally over. Todd was still crumpled in a pathetic, weeping heap on the carpeted floor near the petitioner's table. He was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. 2 massive bailiffs descended upon him. They did not ask him to stand. They reached down and grabbed him by the expensive fabric of his suit jacket, hauling his dead weight up from the floor with brute force. Todd offered no physical resistance. His legs were completely useless. He dangled between the 2 officers like a broken marionette. They slammed him forward onto the surface of the legal table, scattering his forged documents and empty coffee cups. They yanked his arms behind his back, The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like a vault door slamming shut on his future. The cold steel biting into his skin seemed to finally snap Todd out of his catatonic shock. The reality of his impending permanent incarceration washed over him like a wave of freezing water. He began to thrash weakly against the grip of the bailiffs. He twisted his head wildly, searching the courtroom for a lifeline that simply did not exist. His expensive, corrupt lawyer was already backing away toward the gallery, furiously packing his briefcase, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a capital murder charge. His mother was currently being dragged toward the holding cells, her aristocratic dignity completely shattered. Todd was entirely alone. His panicked eyes finally locked onto me. He saw the wealthy father-in-law he had so arrogantly believed he could manipulate and destroy. The absolute terror of his situation stripped away every single ounce of his pride. He began to weep violently. It was not the theatrical, manufactured sorrow he had displayed for the judge just moments ago. It was a raw, ugly, guttural panic. He fought against the heavy hands of the deputies, dragging his feet across the carpet as he tried to throw himself toward me. He begged me to help him. He screamed my name, sobbing uncontrollably, pleading for a mercy he had systematically denied my daughter. Todd choked on his own saliva as he babbled his desperate, pathetic confession. He screamed that he never wanted to hurt Megan. He shrieked that Diane had forced him to do it. He claimed that the underground lending syndicate was going to murder him if he did not produce the $400,000 by Friday afternoon. He wept that the corporate debt collectors were completely ruthless and that they had contacts inside the federal prison system. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging me to understand his impossible position. He sobbed that if he went into a concrete cell with that massive unpaid debt hanging over his head, the syndicate would have his throat cut before the end of the week. He pleaded with me to use my wealth to pay off the holding company. He begged me to save his life. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I stood perfectly still near the center aisle, watching the architect of my daughter's suffering beg for his miserable existence. I took slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance until I was standing less than 2 feet away from his sweating, terrified face. The bailiffs held him tight, preventing him from collapsing back onto the floor. I looked deep into his eyes. I searched for a single microscopic trace of genuine remorse for the physical and psychological torture he had inflicted on my child. I found absolutely nothing but the selfish primal fear of a coward facing the consequences of his own actions. I leaned in close. The ambient noise of the chaotic courtroom seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. I dropped my voice into a low, icy register designed to completely extinguish his final pathetic flicker of hope. I spoke with the absolute devastating clarity of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. I told Todd that he fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of his ruin. I told him that I did not just purchase his $400,000 syndicate debt to use as leverage. I told him that my holding company had executed the acceleration clause the exact second the sun came up this morning. I looked directly into his weeping eyes and delivered the final lethal strike. I told him that while he was sitting in this courtroom committing felony perjury to steal my daughter's trust fund, my corporate attorneys had officially foreclosed on his property. I told him that his bank accounts were permanently frozen, his business assets were completely seized, and his locks were currently being changed by county sheriffs. I told him that he was not going back to his comfortable suburban home. He was evicted. He was completely, absolutely bankrupt. And he was going straight to a concrete cell with a massive target painted on his back. The words struck him with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The frantic pleading instantly died in his throat. His eyes widened to an impossible circumference as the totality of my orchestration finally penetrated his pathetic mind. He realized that the faceless, merciless corporate entity he had been terrified of for the last 48 hours was standing right in front of him. He realized that I had methodically, systematically, and intentionally built the exact trap he had just walked into. The sheer absolute zero of my empathy shattered whatever remained of his psychological fortitude. Todd let out a low, hollow wheeze. His eyes rolled back in his head. The bailiffs did not bother to wake him. They simply hoisted his unconscious dead weight by the armpits and dragged him backward through the heavy wooden doors leading to the subterranean holding cells. I stood in the sudden quiet of the courtroom and watched the heavy doors swing shut. I felt absolutely nothing for the man who was just hauled away. There was no joy in the vengeance. There was only the cold, necessary satisfaction of a cancerous tumor being surgically permanently excised from the body of my family. I turned my back on the empty petitioner's table and walked toward the center of the room. The medical team instinctively parted, creating a clear path for me to approach the wheelchair. I looked down at Megan. Her breathing was steady. The frantic, desperate survival instinct that had fueled her dramatic entrance had softened into a profound, exhausted relief. She looked up at me and offered a weak, trembling smile. I reached out and gently rested my hand against her cheek, feeling the fragile warmth of her skin. The nightmare was officially, irrevocably over. I stepped behind the wheelchair and gripped the rubber handles. I nodded to Owen, who was standing silently near the exit, holding the perimeter secure. He pushed the heavy oak doors open wide. I began to push my daughter down the center aisle, moving away from the sterile mahogany benches and the lingering smell of deceit. We rolled through the grand foyer of the courthouse, leaving the shadows of the legal machinery entirely behind us. We reached the main entrance and passed through the towering glass doors. The sudden, brilliant warmth of the late morning sunlight washed over us, instantly banishing the cold, damp memory of the windowless garage. The bright blue sky stretched out above us, endless and clear. The suffocating, smoldering tension that had gripped my chest for weeks was utterly, entirely extinguished. The parasites had been rooted out and destroyed. We moved forward into the blinding light, the natural order of our family, finally permanently restored, in absolute, unyielding peace. The profound lesson learned from this narrative is that immense arrogance always functions as the primary architect of its own absolute destruction. When individuals choose to view kindness and silence as inherent weaknesses, they inevitably blind themselves to the quiet, methodical strength gathering around them. Greed forces people to severely underestimate those they intend to exploit, leading them to step willingly into perfectly designed traps of their own making. True power does not require loud theatrical displays of aggression or immediate explosive reactions. It requires infinite patience, cold, calculated strategy, and the discipline to let the guilty dig their own inescapable graves. Subscribe now to uncover more thrilling stories where cold, calculated justice finally dismantles arrogant deception.